Doing the right thing, it's important. What does it mean in business? We have no idea. We know what wrong is. Actually, no, we don't. Because we're a successful company, not some boring ethics professor.
It seems that nowadays, politics has invaded every corner of our culture. From film and television, to music, to pop culture in general. Everything is political. However, you might think logically that one aspect of culture that might want to avoid sticking its toes into the political landscape is commerce and branding. Of course, we know that's not been the case, and brands have long been associated and involved with political messaging. But the question is why? What do brands have to gain by applying a political message or meaning to advertisements designed predominantly to sell something as simple as razors? The obvious answer is money. What else? Because that's the point of a company. But because the goal of all companies is to make money, it seems counterintuitive to situate a brand into a controversial political topic. Unless, of course, politics sells. So does it? Does associating a brand with a political belief increase the sales or result in decreased sales via boycotts? Today, let's look at the research on brand affiliation and political messaging, as well as the concept of wokewashing, by beginning with looking at how brands have long been associated with social causes. But first, let me tell you about this video's sponsor, Ground News. As we'll discuss more in this video, advertising, public relations, and news have all become inexorably intertwined to the point where it's almost impossible to determine if what you're reading is a corporate narrative or actual news, which is where Ground News, the world's first news comparison platform, comes in. Ground News Pro allows you to quickly compare and contrast headlines from outlets across the political spectrum from over 50,000 major news publications to see if there's any spin. Their coverage analysis feature allows you to see if the story is only being covered by outlets on one side of the political aisle or the other. Ground News rates outlets as right or left or center based on 3 separate datasets and methodological processes from All Sides, Media Fact Check, and AdFunds Media. Because I'm always skeptical of labels, and I'm sure you are too, dear viewer, let's quickly look at the methodologies used by just one of these sources, All Sides. They use blind bias survey, editorial and independent review, third-party analysis, and ongoing community feedback to get a scientifically accurate idea of where a news outlet generally tends to fall politically. And that's just one of the 3 methodologies used by these sources. Further, with Ground News Pro, you can see the news that you really want to see, be it hyperlocal to your area or international. And you can filter content not just by county or country, but by a wide variety of interests, from sports to science and technology. Check to see how the same story is being covered locally or abroad by spinning the globe and comparing headlines and articles, or even to see what kind of news you or people you generally follow tend to post on social media. Because news narratives are also subject to change, Ground News Pro also allows you to easily track a story that you're interested in to see how coverage of that story changes and evolves over time. If you're interested in supporting the channel and getting a fuller picture of what's happening in the world, click the link down below and check out Ground News, available on iOS and Android devices, as well as a web app and browser extension. So now that you've got access to a great way of comparing stories, and because I so thoroughly support the mission behind Ground News by removing barriers in the way of news media consumers, let's talk about businesses that do good, and begin our investigation on company activism by looking at the research on corporate social responsibility. Historically, brands have tended to avoid associating with any particular political belief because politics is pretty inherently divisive. It doesn't make sense from a financial perspective to potentially alienate a large portion of your customer base by selling a political message along with your cheeseburger. But clearly, it has become a growing trend. While today we might think of the marriage of brands and politics as a decidedly left-leaning tendency, let us not forget the instances of brands linking their products with politics often having come from the right as well, with cases such as Hobby Lobby and Chick-fil-A, and surely MyPillow has been a more recent example of a brand that has built its name on association with more conservative political beliefs. However, despite not being relegated to one side of the political aisle or the other, this phenomenon is definitely a newer development, as in the past most brands tried to avoid politics, being the emotional mess that they often are. For example, Michael Jordan was quoted as saying that Republicans buy sneakers too in the 1990s, but things started to change in the last 10 years or so, as the politics of the United States has also changed to become observably more partisan, as a Gallup poll illustrates that while 43% of Americans considered themselves to be moderates in 1992, As of 2019, the percentage of moderates decreased to 35%, and while self-identified conservatives remained stable at around 37% over time, the percentage of self-described liberals has increased from 17% in 1992 to 24% in 2019. Within political groups, Republicans have become more conservative since the early 90s, all while the conservative and moderate elements of the Democrat Party has seen significant decreases over the last 20 years, and the percentage of self-described liberals who identify with the Democrat Party has doubled. I bring up these Gallup data to illustrate that America has become decidedly more partisan, and moderates have quickly become a dying breed, to say nothing of radical alt-centrism. With these trends in mind, one might expect that brands would really not want to bring up politics as people have become more tribalistic politically, but that's clearly not been the case. Even Michael Jordan walked back his "Republicans buy sneakers too" statement by claiming that it was a joke in 2020. Well, maybe it was a joke. I kinda doubt it. Because it kinda seems to me that in the 1990s, selling shoes was more important to Michael Jordan than selling politics is in the current year. So is Jordan telling the truth? Or have things actually just changed to the point where it was normal to want to sell sneakers to anyone regardless of their political beliefs just 20 years ago, and now the very same notion need be hand-waved as clearly in jest? Well, a study from Shetty, Venkatamaya, and 2019 actually found evidence that yes, Jordan was right, and for some people, yes, politics is more important than the product. Shetty et al. Asked millennials about their opinions towards brands that either engaged in or did not engage in activist messaging towards social justice issues, and found that millennials tended to report that they prefer to buy brands that are associated with activism. This was the case for both male and female millennials, and spanned across different income brackets. Moreover, millennials reported being more willing to pay more money for brands that they relate to activist movements. See, Sony, all you had to do to stop people complaining about their PS4s turning into bricks was to tell them to throw said bricked PS4s through the windows of small businesses at their local biannual riot.
You get stuck in, mate. Have one on me. Well, that'll teach you, Eddie. You should stay out of politics.
Despite this increase, perceptions of fake and insincere activism resulted in backlash among millennials who were less supportive of brands if they perceived that activism as disingenuous. Yet despite the fact that they dislike faux wokeness, they still stated that they believed more companies should engage in woke advertising. The implications here are that millennials, irrespective of their gender or income levels, will support brands that associate with some kind of social justice cause, almost always, unless they perceive that cause or that activism as being overtly phony. Despite the findings of Shetty et al., it's worth noting that while politics may be relatively novel and relegated to millennials, what's not new is the marriage of companies and causes. Forwarding some proceeds from the sales of a product towards a nonprofit or charity cause is something plenty of companies have done for a long time because, simply put, it just looks good and it makes all of us feel good to think we're helping out the less fortunate with every purchase of a box of cereal. Something referred to by researchers as cause-related marketing or CRM, because cash rules everything around me. But the question is, as it always should be in business, does this corporate philanthropy actually help move product? Well, there's plenty of research on just that topic, and we can begin by looking to Strahy-Levitt's 1999, who examined how the type of product and magnitude of a donation, rather than when products remained undiscounted, but the proceeds went towards a cause. Participants received a list of fictitious brands for products that were either frivolous or utilitarian, and were either described as being on sale, or that the same amount as the sale discount would go towards a charity. There is an immediate issue of price here, in that getting $100 off the price of your new pair of Jordans versus your purchase of said Jordans being the normal price but with Nike donating $100 to charity is significantly different from getting $100 off your purchase of a new Tesla versus Elon donating $100 from the purchase of the Tesla to charity, just in terms of cost magnitude. In their first sample, subjects were about 4.5 times more likely to be willing to donate 5% of proceeds to charity rather than receiving a 5% discount, instead of donating 50% of proceeds to charity rather than receiving a 50% discount, specifically when the deal applied to practical products like toothpaste or toilet paper. Similarly, when consumers were offered a choice to forego a 25% discount in favor of 25% of proceeds going to charity, they were 4.4 times less likely to choose the utilitarian product versus when the discount or donation was only 5%. In comparison, people were far more generous when it concerned luxury goods, being 1.3 times less likely to express interest in a product when half of the cost would go to charity rather than when 5% would go to charity. In turn, subjects were 1.58 times less likely to say that they would purchase a luxury product when 25% of the cost would go to charity rather than when 5% went to charity. Between product types, subjects were 3.6 times more willing to donate 50% of the cost, rather than receiving a similar discount on a luxury product rather than a practical product, and 3 times more willing to donate 25% of the cost of a luxury item to charity, rather than receiving a similar discount for a luxury product rather than a practical one. People are pretty unwilling to pay more for utility products that promise to donate proceeds to charity, and while they still prefer smaller donations over larger donations for luxury goods, we are far more willing to eat the cost of a donation on hedonistic items. Probably because part of us feels bad to be spending so much money on something that doesn't really provide any value, while others suffer. A third study further investigated which types of products people would essentially be willing to pay more for when under the impression that the brand was supporting a good cause, with both a luxury and practical brand either offering 1% of proceeds towards charity or 25% towards charity, and found that subjects expressed interest in practical brands that offered the larger donation in 1.56 out of 5 options, compared to an interest in the luxury brand offering larger donations, which subjects expressed an interest towards in 3.5 out of 5 options. So, more than twice as often. This has some pretty important implications for which products should associate themselves with causes. Namely, the more expensive ones, say not fast food chains selling burgers, will likely see more interest in charity causes. Someone who goes to the store with the intent to buy a Gucci bag is going to spend the money on that bag whether it's 50% off or if 50% of the proceeds go to the Harry Styles Hypocrite Foundation. But when it comes to which chocolate bar people actually want to buy, a company like Tony's, which is dedicated to using more expensive but 100% slave-free cocoa, is going to be a bit more expensive than a Hershey's. And for a small decision like buying some chocolate, the bang for the buck is usually more important than supporting the cause. A potentially important component as to why we're seemingly willing to fork over more money for a cause when it comes to a big purchase is because we're already spending a lot, or intending to. We're already committed to the purchase, and the tack on of a little extra money towards charity on a large ticket that we're already intent on buying is less influential than day-to-day spending, and we can see this in some of the old-school tactics of none other than car salesmen.
Okay, here's how it goes. Buyers never tell you what they're willing to spend, and when they talk privately, we spy on them through this one-way mirror.
We'll clean out those stupid Americans.
In persuasion theory, there are 2 general tactics that you'll often find used by greasy car dealers: foot in the door and door in the face. The door in the face technique begins with a big ask. So you roll up at the dealership and the salesperson tells you the car that you're eyeing costs 40 grand. But because you're such a special customer, they're gonna cut you a very special deal and sell you the car for 30 grand instead. Psychologically, this is persuasive because it seems like the salesperson is cutting you a big break, and via the norm of reciprocity, we feel compelled to return the favor by signing a contract and maybe even taking out a huge loan to feel as if we're meeting the salesperson in the middle. In reality, the car was always priced at 30 grand. But this works because we perceive the salesperson as having done something nice for us first, or for those of us who don't buy cars often, compared to Paradox games always being discounted. The other tactic, foot in the door, works the other way around, and is more likely to be the way that you might find charitable organizations attached to other purchases. In foot in the door, the salesman initially prices the car at 20 grand, but once you get ready to start signing the paperwork, they start to mention a bunch of other add-ons that you definitely really want with your car, like an improved speaker system, heated seats, etc. And because you've already agreed to the initial price and have gone this far in the purchasing process, likely having been hanging around this dealership for a good length of time, you've already invested yourself in buying this car and thus are susceptible to additional requests, such as to maintain internal consistency. You've already agreed to buy the car, so to remain psychologically consistent and avoid the uncomfortableness of cognitive dissonance, we're likely to continue to acquiesce to the additional, comparatively small requests of the salesperson compared to the big initial ask of 20 grand. By the time they get down to asking you if you want to spend an extra $500 on a charitable donation to a cause, you end up walking out of the dealership having spent 30 grand on a car you were told cost 20. Using either method, you spent the same amount of money on the car, but the car dealer example, while probably an area wherein these tactics are most common, and also the most greasy, again besides video game DLC, is a bit removed from everyday life since most of us don't buy new cars all the time, and not all of us are gamers.
With the glass ceiling broken, all the oppressed groups shall prosper, especially the most oppressed group of all, gamers.
But we often see foot in the door specifically as it applies to charities all the time in more mundane scenarios. Ever been asked if you want to donate $1 to a cause as you check out of a store? Yeah, that's a foot in the door tactic. You're already spending money, what's an extra dollar? We do this to maintain behavioral consistency. Another issue that faces brands beyond behavioral consistency, though, is brand consistency, in that when a brand involves itself with some social issue, if that issue is unrelated to the brand itself, it can potentially come off as disingenuous, as seen in a study from Roy 2010. Roy's experiment sought to understand congruence between a cause supported by a company and the type of company service, be it utilitarian, in this case the United Parcel Service, or UPS, which serves a functional purpose, or hedonic, in this case Sony Music, which serves an entertainment purpose, supposedly. Participants read that these companies had partnered either with the nonprofit Reading is Fundamental or with the Save the Music Foundation. Logically, Sony Music is more congruent with Save the Music, unless you look too closely into what happened involving Michael Jackson's music, while the UPS is more congruent with Reading is Fundamental. Subjects were asked about their perceptions of the sincerity of these corporate nonprofit collaborations, and Roy found that participants viewed the sponsorship as more sincere when it was congruent with the service of the company. Further, subjects were more positive towards a congruent collaboration between company and nonprofit than an incongruent collaboration, and finally, and perhaps most importantly, subjects reported a greater intent to use the services of either UPS or Sony Music when the company chose to work with a congruent nonprofit organization. So, what happens when a brand that has prided itself on an association with a political ideology violates its supposed ideals or generally violates perceptions of moral corporate behavior? Well, Romani et al. 2015 sought to understand anti-brand activism caused by a violation of the company against its typical moral affiliations. How do people react to something like this ad from Secret, wherein a woman sings a song about the gender pay gap, while ironically lamenting how meaningless singing a song about social issues like the gender pay gap is in an advertisement, trying to sell a product?
Rather make 20 more cents and get the same paycheck as gents than hear a song with a message in it that makes me feel better for 3 minutes. Thanks.
In their first study, the researchers selected two companies that have somewhat negative public perceptions, Nestle and Dolce & Gabbana. Nestle has been criticized for ethical violations in the form of controversial marketing practices involving infant formula, water quality in poor countries, and labor practices, while Dolce & Gabbana is mostly disliked by people who find the brand to be representative of vapid materialism and elitism.
It's like when I go shopping. I have to have the most expensive thing. Not because it's expensive, but because it costs more.
Participants were specifically gathered from anti-fan pages for the two companies and were asked questions about their opposition or even hate towards these businesses. They found that perceptions of corporate moral violations on anti-brand activism was mediated by feelings of hatred. More specifically, the stronger the perception of a company's moral violations, the stronger the feelings of hate and the greater consumer anti-brand activism. Further, empathy played a role in that the level of empathy interacts with the perceptions of moral violations, such that the greater the level of personal empathy people possess, the more hate felt by consumers. A second study sought to generalize these findings outside of the specific brands that subjects probably had very strong emotions to beforehand because they were collected from anti-fan hate groups. Participants answered a few basic questions about their preferences for products and were given a description of one of two fictitious companies, either one that exploits child labor in developing countries, or another that was described as being dissimilar from the typical product preferences of subjects in terms of their fashion tastes. As with the first study, consumer empathy and perception of corporate moral violations was related to increased hate, which in turn mediated the effect on consumers' intentions to engage in anti-brand activism. This was the case regardless of individual personality characteristics. In other words, people are sensitive to perceived moral transgressions of companies and can express feelings of hatred towards a company that they see as transgressing by exploiting children or engaging in sketchy market practices. The big question when it comes to any business practice, no matter how much positive press it may generate for a company, no matter how many acres of rainforest it saves or how much support it provides for homeless orphans, will always be, at the end of the day, does it make money? That's every single company's primary duty to its shareholders after all, to pull a profit. So does corporate social responsibility increase financial performance? Dodd and Supa 2014 provide us with some answers in their analysis of outcomes of CSR campaigns. Subjects were questioned on their general support of several social issues, including same-sex marriage, healthcare reform, and emergency contraception, and then shown a series of real public statements from a variety of corporations providing company support for or against these issues. The stimuli were paraphrased from official statements made by Starbucks and Chick-fil-A as pro and anti-same-sex marriage respectively, Whole Foods and Walmart as pro and anti-healthcare reform respectively, and Nike and Hobby Lobby as pro and anti-emergency contraception respectively. Participant attitudes and intentions to purchase products from these companies were measured, while the control group merely read a definition of what corporate social responsibility is and were asked if they would plan to purchase from any responsible organization rather than a non-responsible one. An astonishing 80% of the variance in purchase intention was accounted for in terms of agreement or disagreement with corporate social responsibility activism. Comparatively, 60% of the variance in purchase intention was explained by past behavior. That is, if you always buy Chick-fil-A because you like their product, then you're unlikely to just stop because you disagree with their stance on same-sex marriage. Because we all know you can't make delicious tendies with only cocks.
You know, Doctor, I'm getting a little tired of the sexual innuendo.
Innuendo.
Moreover, participants generally expressed increased intent to purchase a product when exposed to advocacy messages that match their own attitudes towards the social political issue than when they were exposed to corporate social advocacy messages that did not align with their own attitudes towards that social political issue. So yeah, it seems that corporations don't even have to actually engage in CSR behaviors by donating to different nonprofits. They need merely make CSR statements to encourage some people who agree with the company's political stance to at least report that they would be more willing to purchase products from that company. But is that really even corporate social responsibility at that point? Or is it just baiting people with the promise that the company holds some value that it doesn't necessarily need to actually promote in any meaningful way? If the company is not donating money to save the rainforest, does it matter that they say they care about rainforests? Further, while these data from Dodd and Supa indicate how people said they would vote with their wallets, is that how they actually do in the long run? To understand when corporate social responsibility ceases to be responsible and simply becomes lip service, and the effects of said lip service on the bottom line, we need to look at the growing trend of wokewashing. While companies have been donating to causes for a long time, and we've seen how effective particularly luxury brands can be at getting us to pay to support a cause, there is a newer type of corporate partnership with causes that's arisen in the last few years, and that's brands not so much donating money to help the homeless, but simply packaging their product in a way that appears to align with a political cause, a practice known as wokewashing. So what is wokewashing? Well, if you remember greenwashing, a similar marketing tactic that began in the 1990s that justified selling goods at a higher price due to alleged environmental friendliness of the brand, wokewashing is giving an unrelated product a coat of social justice left-wing politic paint, all while hiking the price and often with no real identifiable commitment to put any of the increased cost of these products towards any meaningful charitable contribution. A perhaps uniquely egregious example is Marks & Spencer's, a UK grocery chain selling a lettuce, guacamole, bacon, and tomato sandwich, get it, LGBT, in a rainbow paper box for 4.45 euros, the equivalent of about $5.50 USD, 388 GBP, 695 Australian, and 672 Canadian, for a cold BLT with a smear of guac. For reference, I went to my local Marks & Spencer's to see what the average cost of some of their sandwiches are, and found that, at least in 2021, the LGBT sandwich was about 50 pence more than their average sandwich, and about 20 pence more than their fancy sandwiches, like wild salmon and cucumber or smoked salmon and cream cheese. And just to be a little bit fair to Marks & Spencer's, for those outside of the UK, it's about as posh as grocery stores go, so it's always going to be a little bit more expensive than its competitors. But the problem with wokewashing is that for every easily impressionable person who might fall for the marketing ploy, seemingly 5 more are infuriated by what they see as hollow pandering and corporate greed. Or just because woke pandering can never go far enough, as surely someone somewhere was offended with the lack of a Q and an I and an A representation in Marks & Spencer's Bigot sandwich.
What do you like on your sandwich? A little bit of ketchup and white pride, white power.
But despite blowback after blowback, this keeps happening. In 2017, Kendall Jenner's ad for Pepsi, which featured the star at an apparent Black Lives Matter protest, giving a soda to a cop, received significant backlash, or is it perhaps blacklash, from the woke scold crowd it was seemingly designed to appeal to. In the same year, Audi spent millions on a Super Bowl commercial and associated messaging to supposedly raise awareness about the gender wage gap, only for, again, the very people that this ad was meant to inspire to buy an Audi immediately snapping back by pointing out that there are only 2 women on Audi's executive team. And that Audi, like pretty much every other company, because women tend to work fewer hours, be in the workforce for a shorter length of time, and do less demanding jobs, in general make less at Audi than men do. This has continually blown up in the faces of beauty and fashion companies with their increasing use of, well, let's just say not conventionally attractive models. From Gillette to Calvin Klein, only for many of these companies to then be criticized by the same woke left that they are appealing to. For example, in the case of fashion company Everlane, they came under fire for featuring plus-size models in their ads, despite the fact that at the time, Everlane didn't offer sizes above a women's size 10. Then again, it can't really be any worse than the Abercrombie & Fitch CEO saying that they don't make clothes for ugly people, despite, looking like he does. Perhaps the biggest offender of woke-washing is Burger King, which previously started selling milkshakes after McDonald's ceased because far-left activists kept engaging in wasteful capitalism by buying them just to throw them at people. They then released chicken fingers that they charged twice the normal price for, supposedly in some sort of criticism of the pink tax and not totally as an easy money grab. They used colorful rainbow wrapping to try and sell more Whoppers, supposedly in support of the LGBTQ community, although at least, unlike Marks & Spencer's, they didn't have the audacity to charge more for them, and perhaps most recently caught flack for selling Unhappy Meals, another slight at McDonald's, only to get called out for the fact that most of their employees make wages so low as to likely be unable to afford mental health care, the exact thing that the Unhappy Meal was supposed to be promoting. But while all of these corporate actions may have been criticized, did they actually have any financial impact? Is there any evidence of the classic get woke, go broke paradigm? Well, Gillette's 2019 ad condemning toxic masculinity as it manifests in the form of, grilling, coincided with an $8 billion non-cash write-down from the parent company P&G. On the flip side, Nike reported soaring profits of over $6 billion despite controversy following its ad campaigns featuring Colin Kaepernick. Even when it doesn't catch backlash, woke-washing has become so ubiquitous that seemingly every company puts a rainbow flag in their Twitter bio in June, sends out messages about Black history in February, and about gender equality in March. Be they a major bank or military contractor like Northrop Grumman or Lockheed Martin.
I'm a woman of color. I am a mom. I am a cisgender millennial who's been diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder.
CIA.
Woke-washing is everywhere, even though it seems to evoke outrage in a lot of the people that it's designed to pander to, just as often as applause. So while we can see these examples all over the place in practice, it's not enough to just bring up anecdotes. We have to look at the data. First, let's really delineate cause-related marketing from woke-washing, which Vredenberg et al. 2020 did in a study on the subject. They proffer several examples, with Pampers' partnership with UNICEF representing cause-related marketing, Heineken's Drink Responsibly ads as corporate social marketing, R.J. Reynolds' classic selling cigarettes with the promise that doctors approve of the product as advocate advertising, and Gillette's ads on toxic masculinity being representative of woke-washing. But if people are often accepting of corporate social responsibility, just how do people actually respond to woke-washing? Positively, negatively, or otherwise? Well, a 2019 survey from Edelman, a global communication firm, found that 56% of consumers reported too many brands use societal issues primarily as a marketing ploy to sell more of their products. Somewhat paradoxically, 53% of respondents believed every company should get involved in at least one social issue, and a previous survey from Edelman in 2018, they found that 64% of respondents worldwide believed that CEOs should lead social change rather than waiting for the government, and in the US alone, 69% of respondents supported CEO activism.
Christmas is about giving something back to the community. That's why every year I like to go to the local youth centre and give out presents to the kids, dressed as you-know-who. Princess Diana.
It seems hypocritical, but perhaps not when the majority of Americans want corporations to be active in social issues, yet disagree on which social issues are worth supporting. The next question is then, is woke-washing helpful or hurtful to a brand? Unlike cause-related marketing, corporate activism has a tendency to really piss people off, at least when it's seen as hypocritical as so many of the aforementioned examples are, and Vredenberg attempted to isolate the sweet spot, where corporate activism becomes agitating by developing a 4-point topology, comprised of absence of activism, which describes brands that keep themselves removed from any kind of activism, but can be seen as authentic due to a desire to be neutral. Silent brand activism, which describes corporations that make donations behind the scenes but don't overtly support a cause in their marketing, and that's typically seen as pretty authentic. Authentic activism, which describes when a company is financially involved in a cause and also markets based on that cause, but as the name implies, it's usually seen as authentic, perhaps because the company and the cause align. And finally, there's inauthentic brand activism, which describes when a business engages in little to no financial support of a cause, but relies heavily on marketing that cause, and as such is seen as inauthentic and turns people off. That is, when companies are making but not giving money while leeching off of a popular social issue. For example, in 2018, the Irish gambling company Paddy Power got an empty double-decker bus, which they called the official bus of gay professional footballers, and drove it around a pride parade in Brighton, promising to donate money to the Attitude Foundation every time a Russian footballer scored in the 2018 World Cup. Except, being a betting company, by encouraging people to bet against Russia, they would be making money off of this campaign, which made the whole stunt seem hollow and frankly a bit grotesque and hypocritical, not to mention that driving a rainbow double-decker bus, owned by a company called Paddy Power with a big PP written on the side, around an English town sounds like an IRA gay op. This is a problem with incongruity, as Renenberg predicts, in that when a company's goals misalign with the messaging of their marketing or their corporate behaviors, people feel a sense of disgust, particularly when the company has only recently adopted these woke attitudes. Instead, Renenberg posits that there is also a sense of delight experienced by consumers when a company carefully approaches social issues that are only slightly incongruous with previous stances held by the corporation or business. In other words, the company doing better. Perhaps we want to see companies take a stance on social issues, but we draw the line when that stance is overtly hypocritical. Hypocrisy is a big issue when it comes to wokewashing, when companies are making cash hand over fist by vaguely pretending to care. And we can see that in data in a series of studies from Wagner, Lutz, and Weitz, 2009. In their first experiment, subjects read about a fictional electronics store, PowerMart, which had made a public statement on some societal issue, either the environment, employee treatment, or the national economy, and they then read a fabricated journal article that either provided evidence that the company's behavior matched their marketing or exposed the hypocrisy of the company. Other subjects read that the article came first and the corporate statement second. An example of hypocrisy would be PowerMart announcing that they had a commitment to preserving the environment and then being outed for dumping trash into a landfill over capacity and polluting the local water supply.
You see that sign there that says toxic spill? Yeah. What's that?
Disregard that, Frank. It's a bunch of liberal bullshit.
In the opposite direction, some subjects first read the news article that PowerMart was the largest importer of Chinese electronic goods, and then read a statement from the company that PowerMart was dedicated to selling only American products. They found that consumer perception of corporate hypocrisy had a significant negative impact on their attitudes towards the firm, both directly and indirectly, through a negative effect on inconsistent corporate responsibility. Further, participants who were exposed to statements followed by behaviors, for example, the corporate statement from PowerMart saying they support environmentalism, then being exposed as causing pollution, exhibited higher perceptions of corporate hypocrisy than participants who were presented with behaviors followed by a statement. For example, the news reporting PowerMart buys Chinese products, followed by a statement that they support American products. People dislike brands more when they don't live up to their own statements and expectations, rather than when brands mess up and then make a statement that they intend to do better. Or at least that was the case in 2009. But an issue with a lot of wokewashing is, unlike the concrete statements from PowerMart in that first study, that they definitely buy American or they definitely want to help the environment, against which the hypocrisy is quite jarring, a lot of corporate wokewashing causes are far less opaque. Not a statement about the company's dedication to hiring more women, just a statement about why hiring more women is good. Thus, in a second study in this set, subjects either read a concrete statement from PowerMart stating definitively that they plan to offer healthcare benefits to all employees, or an abstract statement wherein the company just implied, more loosely, that it is dedicated to ensuring the well-being of its employees. Either before or after reading one of these two corporate statements, subjects read a news report which explained that PowerMart does not provide medical insurance to the large majority of its employees. Perceptions of corporate hypocrisy were middling when the official statements were more ambiguous, regardless of whether the statement preceded or preceded the news report. In turn, when the concrete statement was offered first, and the company was then exposed by the media as being hypocritical, perceived hypocrisy was highest, while perceived hypocrisy was lowest when the news reported on a corporate action, followed by a statement that was inconsistent with those actions. That is, people, at least a decade ago, did not see companies as generally hypocritical when that company promised to improve their practices, perhaps even expecting such a statement. However, they perceive companies as being very hypocritical when they make concrete statements and are subsequently exposed as not living up to their own standards. In turn, making abstract statements produces moderate levels of hypocrisy even when companies don't live up to them, regardless of order, which is perhaps exactly why we see so many companies make vague statements in support of social issues without promising any real change or any real money changing hands. It's why Marks & Spencer's can put a rainbow flag on their sandwich but not actually have to donate any money to LGBTQ causes. It costs them nothing, and it doesn't really produce feelings of hypocrisy compared to if they were to make a specific dedication to a cause.
We're just doing our little part to make sure that our products do not aid in harming environments like this one here, where animals live and thrive, and there's an endangered species right there.
In a final study in this set, the authors set out to understand the effects of inoculation on corporate hypocrisy. Inoculation is a term in persuasion research which refers to the tactic of providing the audience with a weakened form of potential counter-arguments, so that when the counter-argument is made, the wind has been taken out of its sails. It's been preempted with a weakened version, much as how vaccines inoculate patients with a weakened form of a virus. The same stimuli as before were utilized, but this time, between the news article and the corporate statement, PowerMart released an inoculating statement. For the environmental scenario, for example, PowerMart's statement reiterated a commitment to the environment, but they admit there have been some isolated incidences wherein the company was unable to live up to its high standards. As before, order was manipulated, so some subjects heard the pro-environmental statement from the company first, then the inoculation, and finally the media exposé, while others heard the media exposé, then the inoculation, and finally the pro-environmental statement. As anticipated, inoculation significantly reduced perceptions of corporate hypocrisy, but as before, hypocrisy was reduced more when the behavior was reported on first, followed by the inoculation and finally the corporate statement, rather than when the statement preceded the inoculation and media report. Thus, it's better for companies to not only make vague statements, but when caught in a lie, to attempt to minimize the issue before providing a new mission statement. This is all indicative that people are quite forgiving of companies when they pretend to apologize by giving a new promise to improve in the future, and really dislike it when companies go against concrete promises they have made in the past. However, this negative perception can be ameliorated by owning up to a weakened form of the criticism, not the actual criticism itself. It's all measured gaslighting. It's the corporate dentist system.
She'll start questioning her self-worth, start questioning her self-esteem. And that's the perfect time to inspire hope.
Corporate hypocrisy then seems to be based on whether or not the company specifically defines itself as political, and then fails to meet its standards that it itself set, which was examined by Korshin et al. 2019 across a series of studies. A pilot survey provided participants with a list of companies that they rated as very suited to take a political stance or as very unsuited, and the primary difference appeared to be that political companies were seen as more values-driven, while apolitical companies were seen as more market-driven. In their first experiment, subjects were approached at a major pharmacy chain and asked to participate by initially reading a press release type description of the pharmacy, described as priding itself either on data or on values. Next, participants read a fabricated news article about a proposed legislation regarding the death penalty in the pharmacy's headquartered state, and that the pharmacy had either taken no stance on the legislation, or a stance in support of or in opposition to the legislation. Subjects were then asked to walk around the store and locate a specific hard-to-find ointment, to spend some time in the location before answering some additional questions about any purchases made during their trip. 19% of all subjects reported typically buying something that they didn't initially plan to buy on their visit to the pharmacy. However, this varied significantly based on experimental condition. That is, when shoppers read that the pharmacy abstained from involvement in the law, 23% of subjects reported buying more when the company was market-driven, while only 16% purchased more when the company was values-driven. In direct contrast, when the company was values-driven, 22% of shoppers bought more than they intended to when the company took a stance, and only 14.6% reported buying more when the company was values-driven and took no stance on the topic. This was only the case when the company supported the legislation rather than opposing it. This indicates that people may purchase more from companies that they see as taking action and sticking their proverbial necks out rather than simply denouncing some social issue, particularly when that company has defined itself as values-driven. But the most important key takeaway here is that people tend to dislike an apolitical company getting involved in politics and a political company abstaining, desiring corporate consistency. Thus, a second study sought to understand if the type of company, being values or market-driven, mediates the perceptions of hypocrisy on corporate reactions to social issues. Ben & Jerry's is always political, so we might view it as hypocritical for Ben & Jerry's to not make a political statement regarding some current event. while we might similarly find it hypocritical for a company that focuses on money over morals to suddenly take a social position, like Steakums suddenly having a lot to say about Neil deGrasse Tyson's ongoing promotion of scientism over science, although I certainly love it, even if I don't love Steakums. In this experiment, subjects were given a short description of a fictional female hygiene company that was either values-driven or market-driven, and either abstained from comment on a local law that would require women seeking abortion to visit a clinic twice, supported the proposed legislation, or opposed it. Afterwards, perceptions of hypocrisy were measured, and the researchers found that taking no stance and abstaining led to greater perceived hypocrisy than when the brand had any other opinion on the topic, but only when the company was values-driven. Instead, when the company was market-driven, abstaining from politics and taking a stance against requiring women to visit a clinic twice before an abortion was seen as less hypocritical than supporting the proposed legislation. Again, when the company described itself as market-driven, when they took a stand against the issue rather than abstaining, subjects did not report being any more or any less likely to purchase their products. However, when the company described itself as values-driven, taking a stand against the issue rather than abstaining led to lower perceptions of corporate hypocrisy, which in turn led to higher intentions to purchase the product. Thus, for market-driven companies, it is best to not get involved in political conflicts, lest the company be seen as hypocritical and potentially lose sales. While for heavily political or value-based companies like Chick-fil-A, taking a congruent political stance can encourage purchasing behavior. We're okay with companies being political, but if they are political, they perhaps need to be political all of the time to not appear hypocritical.
But with American defense, the decay is stopped before it starts. That's why 9 out of 10 small countries choose American defense.
In their final study, the researchers proposed that corporate agency may play a role in perceptions of hypocrisy or even deceit when a company abstains or engages in political messaging. That is, some companies are legally required to refrain from making public statements while others are not, and thus some companies are more agentic than others. This time, subjects read about a design company that again defined itself as either moral-driven or market-driven, and had abstained from commenting on new legislation regarding immigration. They then read a short news article that stated a law professor had said taking a stance on political issues was either viable or not viable for some companies. Hypocrisy was highest when subjects read about the values-driven business that was also highly agentic in that they believed legal experts had said companies were able to take a public stance on these kinds of political issues like immigration, compared to when they read that companies were not able to take a public stance. There was low perceived hypocrisy for the market-driven company regardless of agency. Intentions to purchase the services or products of the design company were influenced as well, but only for companies with high perceived agency when they abstained from comment, which decreased purchase intentions as perceived hypocrisy increased. Since I previously mentioned companies promising to do better, as tired of a phrase as it is, can companies return from a tarnished reputation by supporting social causes? Despite the findings of Wagner et al. That seem to indicate inoculation and news statements will work in reducing perceptions of hypocrisy, it's not uncommon for people to doubt the sincerity of corporate messages promising to clean up their act. So, does sincerity play a role? Well, for answers we can look to Yoon, Gerhan Conley, and Schwartz, 2006, who introduced subjects to a fictional cigarette manufacturer, Zenit, a product that inherently carries a lot of negative connotations. After reading a short description of the company, subjects then read a short write-up describing either how Zenit was one of the largest corporate sponsors of cancer research or one of the largest corporate sponsors of environmental protectionism. The source of this report either came from Zenit's personal PR or a more neutral journalistic source, the Corporate Social Rating Monitor. Subjects then rated how positive they felt towards Zenit, how sincere they believed their dedication to either health or environmental causes was, and how credible they believed Zenit to be as a company. Subjects were more negative towards Zenit when they supported environmentalism over cancer research, when the source of their activism came from the company's own PR department. In fact, there was a boomerang effect when the company supported a cause unrelated to the problems that it inevitably causes, namely cancer in this case, in that compared to the control group who read no message about Zenit's corporate activism, subjects who read about their public relations promotion of environmental causes were even more negative towards the fictitious cigarette manufacturer. In turn, subjects who read about the promotion of cancer research from a neutral source had about the same opinion of Zenit as the control. In other words, activism did nothing to make the cigarette company look better in the eyes of people, and instead activism that rung hollow, helping a cause unrelated to the issues that the company exacerbates by its very existence, made people dislike that company far more. This is perhaps why it really rubs people the wrong way when food companies politicize their sandwiches with causes unrelated to, say, the meat industry or GMOs. For all of Burger King's bizarre attempts at wokewashing, at least the Impossible Whopper was selling a virtue related to the product itself, while in contrast, it certainly comes off as distasteful when the same company that pays most of its workers minimum wage decides to charge twice as much for tendies in a pink box as some sort of political message.
Why am I Mr. Pink? Because you're a f***, all right?
Because the first experiment used a fake company from an industry with a particularly negative reputation, in a second experiment the researchers chose to replicate the findings with a real company from a still mostly disliked industry, the oil and gas giant ExxonMobil. First, all subjects read a short company biography of Exxon, which included a strong condemnation of the company's environmental accountability, because nothing really says, "now you f***ed up," quite like causing an environmental disaster so massive they wrote sea shanties about it.
She was commissioned to haul the black tar, built the Northumbria there on the bar. Roll, Northumbria, roll.
Next, experimental subjects read the same stimuli as before from the first study, either describing Exxon's dedication to helping cancer research or environmental programs, coming either from a journalistic source or from Exxon itself, and again, liking of Exxon, perceptions of the company's sincerity and credibility were measured. Once again, participants were less supportive of Exxon when it involved itself with cancer research rather than environmental programs, and were particularly negative of Exxon when the source of the information was internal rather than from a news outlet. However, when subjects felt that Exxon's support was insincere, the minor increase in positivity produced when the article came from an external source rather than Exxon itself was diminished. And there's actually a really good real-world reason for that. Namely, much of what you see published in news outlets, as it pertains to businesses, does frequently come directly from a company itself, and not from journalistic investigation, even if it seems like it's legitimate news, in what's called a press release. For those unfamiliar, companies intentionally contact journalistic outlets and send them pre-written articles, called press releases. Because, hey, news coverage is free advertising, and if you ascribe to the "any news is good news" adage, then as long as the company's name is being published, it's good for the company. Now, journalists are taught to not just take a press release and publish it to their outlet, but, and speaking as someone with some personal experience having worked in public relations in the private sector for 5 years on and off, lots of journalists are more than happy to have an article written for them, and will often just change a few words around and publish the corporate-sponsored press release like it's real news. For example, a 2020 survey from Liana Technologies found that 27% of journalists they polled admitted that they only make small changes to press releases, and 8% admit to not changing anything but the headline. So yeah, it's not uncommon for what you read in a newspaper to essentially be corporate advertising. Thus, it's actually a good thing that people don't just believe what's being published in a supposedly neutral journalistic outlet to be little more than paid company promotion. Because it's not like we've had any issues with journalistic integrity over the years in a certain sector or anything. As such, in a third study from Unidol, sincerity of a corporation was examined in more detail, particularly when so many companies have PR departments that are potentially influencing, if not directly supplying, the media with content. When it comes to corporate sincerity, we kind of anticipate that if a company says they're taking money in for a charity, then the profits are actually going to that charity and not to, say, supplying their PR team with more resources just to brag about the charity that they're not actually helping. But that's not always the case, as Avon was embroiled in a scandal in the early 2000s after it was revealed that 40% of the money that the company raised for breast cancer awareness ended up being funneled back into the company's public relation and advertising funds, which probably happens a lot more than we even know about. So how do people feel when a company uses a cause to finance their own advertisement? In this final experiment, subjects either read about a cigarette company or a nicotine patch company, and saw how these two companies ranked in terms of the amount of money spent on advertising versus the amount spent given to charity. As you might expect, subjects were more supportive of the expenditures of the nicotine patch company than the cigarette company in general, but both companies were susceptible to backlash when they spent more on advertising than on corporate social responsibility projects. Participants perceived more sincerity from the nicotine patch company, a company with a better reputation, but still were unhappy when the nicotine patch company spent more on advertising than on charity. In other words, if a company wants to involve itself in a cause, whatever that cause may be and whatever the company is, then that company better spend more on donations to charity than they do on their advertising, lest people view the company negatively. It doesn't matter if you're selling cigarettes or a method of helping smokers quit. If the advertising is more important than the charity and than the cause, then it looks bad. It comes off as empty and as virtue signaling, and people don't appreciate it very much. So how do people feel about empty woke washing? Mukherjee and Althusian, 2020, sought to answer these questions. Does wokewashing and politically valenced advertising help or hurt a brand in their own series of studies? In their first experiment, subjects read a short statement from a fictitious pencil company regarding illegal immigration to the United States, one of which supported deportation and the other opposed deportation and favored amnesty. Participants then answered questions about their attitude towards the brand, their agreement with the brand statement, their level of identification with the brand, and their feelings of moral anger and response to their statement. Those who disagreed with the stance of the company on immigration were 1.55 times less positive towards the company than those who agreed with their stance, and this effect was mediated by identification with the brand. Those who agreed with the company's stance were as positive towards the pencil maker as those in the control group who read no such stance on immigration, indicating that associating your company with a political stance has no real capacity to positively affect consumer attitudes and can only alienate customers. But a pretty much immediate problem with this first study is that these effects were identified in reference to a fictional company that inherently subjects have no familiarity with. So in a follow-up experiment, the researchers first polled participants on their familiarity with various pencil makers. 2 weeks later, subjects read a supposed blog post that contained a logo and a short history of a pencil company, as well as the company's stance on immigration. One company was relatively more well-known, so something like Bic, while the other was relatively unknown. Once again, respondents were less positive towards the pencil manufacturer when they disagreed with the company's stance, but there was no effect of increased positivity towards the brand when they agreed with the company's stance. Moreover, familiarity played no role in this relationship. People disliked Bic just as some random unknown pencil company when they disagreed with Bic's public stance on immigration. Additionally, subjects who disagreed reported that they would be less likely to purchase a product from the brand they disagreed with on politics, at least so far as it applies to pencils.
Peggy Hill is down to her last pencil. She has no more pencils in reserve. Pencil!
In a second study, the researchers manipulated a company's stance on abortion rather than immigration, because the first question clearly wasn't contentious enough, to further understand how brand activism would influence attitudes towards a well-known pizza company. So because they haven't gotten themselves in enough of their own real-world political kerfuffles, and because the researchers don't specify which pizzeria was used in their stimuli, let's just say it's Papa John's. Participants read a blog post about the pizza giant that began with basic information about the company and ended with a segment describing the company's stance on abortion, either being pro-life or pro-choice, and their financial support of activism groups related to that stance. The quality of the company itself was also manipulated, such that some subjects read the pizza chain had recently downgraded or upgraded the quality of their cardboard pizza boxes, which would affect both the company's bottom line and the pizza quality, such that the higher quality box helps retain heat better, but the company would take a financial hit utilizing these superior boxes and vice versa. Afterwards, subjects were asked if they would be willing to share a news article on social media about how the pizzeria recently won an award, and were even incentivized to do so, being offered a 12% increase in their payment for completing the study if they chose to share the post with a specific hashtag. As with the previous studies, participants were less positive towards Papa John's when they disagreed with the company's statement on abortion, and the degree of decreased positivity was mediated by existing identification with the brand. However, information about an increase or decrease in product quality had no effect on reported positivity. Similarly to the previous study, there was no significant positive change in attitudes towards Papa John's when the subjects agreed with their stance on abortion. Once again, making a political point seems to only be detrimental to business. People generally don't care so much about whether or not a pizza maker changes the quality of their cardboard boxes, but they do care about said pizzeria's political positions only when they disagree with that position. That is, if Papa John's wants to sell the most pizza, then Papa John Schneider should keep his mouth shut on political issues, because even people who agree with his takes don't necessarily feel any more positive towards his pies, while people who disagree experience significantly decreased positivity towards the company. We expect pizza places to concern themselves with only one kind of box. And speaking of Papa John, oftentimes when it comes to a brand controversy, there's a specific person who upsets consumers rather than a statement made by the company's PR department or a cringy advert. So in a third experiment in this set, the researchers sought to further explicate the relationship between brand attitudes and statements made either from a spokesperson, the CEO, or a brand ambassador, made either publicly or privately. Subjects in this study saw an advertisement for an unnamed chocolate company, and then read a comment either from an official spokesperson of the brand, the CEO of the company, but as a private citizen, or a brand ambassador as a private citizen. The comment was either in support of or in opposition to amnesty for illegal migrants. Unsurprising for a chocolate company, because perhaps no other industry is more infamous for engaging in human trafficking than chocolatiers.
Midgets were never enslaved, unless you count the Wonka factory.
Once again, subjects generally didn't care more or less about the statement when they agreed with it, and were about as favorable towards the company when they agreed with their stance as were those who read nothing about immigration. This was so regardless of who made the statement. The same was not the case when respondents disagreed with the company's political position, and they expressed the lowest degrees of approval of the brand when the statement was an official one made by a spokesperson in public. Regardless, all participants who disagreed with the political statement from the chocolatier were less positive than the control group no matter who made the statement, be it in public or in private. Subjects were also asked to write a short report on how they felt towards the company, which were coded by doctoral students to identify how they reacted morally to the statement. Participants were more likely to rationalize the statement when it came from a spokesperson in an official capacity. However, this was comparatively quite rare to the other moral responses. Instead, most subjects tended to couple the company with the morality of the stance when it was a public statement from an official rather than a private statement from a CEO or brand ambassador. People were more able to separate the political opinion from the company when it was made in private than when it was an official statement from a spokesperson. That wasn't really how it played out for Papa John Schneider, who got ousted from his own company for criticizing Colonel Sanders' use of the N-word by, well, using the word in reference to why he disagreed with the behavior. However, that's how it appears in this dataset.
We all know that when it comes to the chicken of America, I prefer the white meat to the dark. But never in my 140 years on this earth have I ever harmed a gay.
After a company makes some clumsy or hypocritical political statement, inevitably comes the mea culpa, the apology. So a final study in this set was conducted to see how apologies influence attitudes towards brands. Subjects in this experiment saw an ad for a fictional soft drink brand, and then read a statement from the company regarding a planned free speech event on a college campus, which invited controversial speakers to discuss sensitive issues such as race and IQ, Islam, and abortion, because soda companies are well known for taking on controversial stances. Some participants read that the soda company's official stance on the event was supportive, by emphasizing the importance of free speech, while others read that the soda company's stance was negative, calling for the speakers to not have a platform to spread their hateful rhetoric. Next, some read that the company faced significant backlash for this statement, with calls to boycott the soda company and a protest occurring in front of their headquarters. Finally, some read that the company issued a formal apology for their statement, and as usual, brand attitudes were measured. These results are pretty clear. Never, ever, ever apologize. As with the other studies in this set, subjects generally weren't any more favorable towards the soda brand when they agreed with their statement on free speech. However, their attitude towards the company was significantly diminished when the company subsequently apologized for supporting free speech. The only time in this series of studies that we have seen a single significant effect on people who agreed with the political stance of a company or of its representatives was in a negative direction, specifically when the company apologized for their position. Similarly, corporate apologia had no positive effect on those who disagreed with the company's initial opinion on free speech either. That is, apologizing does not help, it only hurts. So as a pro tip to companies that find themselves embroiled in controversy, never apologize. It can only make it worse. And while brands may think they're going to be applauded for aligning themselves with some political or social issue, the people who agree with whatever that stance is that the brand makes will inevitably be no more positive towards the brand for their actions, and instead, such messaging actually only serves to further alienate those who disagree. So what happens when brands don't express political positions compared to expressing them? Whether or not companies should just avoid political messages altogether was examined by Youngblood and Yonan 2021, and their first experiment provides some international confirmation of what we've already seen in this video. In their first study, German participants were given 2 mock ads from a real beer company and a real detergent company, one of which favored a liberal political position and the other a conservative position. For example, one ad showed a rainbow beer can with text that reads, "One beer, one can, all genders," and the other depicts 2 beer cans, one pink with the female symbol and the other blue with the male symbol, reading, "Everything stays the same with us, make up your mind." Participant attitudes toward the brands were measured before and after seeing these advertisements, and their political beliefs and reaction to the ads were assessed. As we've seen before, subjects were more negative towards the brand when they disagreed with the message than they were positive when they agreed with the message. That is, making political messages really only has the power to alienate, not to increase attitudes when the customer likes the political position. Youngblood and Yonen's second study assessed whether or not political messaging then was better than corporate activism in a study of US participants who were exposed to a series of advertisements from a fictitious water company, Mount Augusta. I said Augusta, not Augustus. Get out of here, Hadrian. Even though we are about to talk about a wall. One advertisement was apolitical, simply reading #drinkwater, proudly supported by my boy Sheo Gorath.
Oh, drink water, drink water, drink water, bitch. Oh, drink water, drink water, drink water, bitch.
While the other four promoted some political message or belief, either being in support of or opposed to the border wall, or being in favor of or in opposition to gun control. The political ads were accompanied by a faux Wall Street Journal article that described the CEO's approval of these new ad campaigns. Subjects were asked how likely they thought they would be to buy a bottle of Mount Augusta or to recommend the water brand to a friend. They were also polled on how important brand choice was in purchasing water, and questioned on their involvement in politics and skepticism towards advertising. Compared to the control group that simply advocated drinking water, participants who agreed with the political message said they would be more likely to buy Mount Augusta, while those who disagreed said they would be less likely to. This was the case regardless of political affiliation or political involvement, meaning even people generally apolitical are affected by corporate activism. Further, they found that approval had no effect on category involvement, that is, an interest and enthusiasm towards a product, for those who agreed with the messaging. However, there was a negative effect on category involvement for those who disagreed, indicating a potential for boycotts from those who were offended by Mount Augusta's messages. The results that we've seen over and over again in these data seem to indicate that there is no real gain for brands, it seems, by engaging in corporate activism, and any gains seen are likely to be mitigated by backlash. But while there may be no direct gains, going woke surely must make a company more prone towards boycotts and buycotts, given the popularity or lack of popularity of certain political movements, right? Well, that might not necessarily be the case either, so let's cover the efficacy and effects of boycotts and buycotts. Frequently, when we hear about a boycott of a product, due to the political stance of its owner or due to some sort of advertising faux pas, we often hear about an associated boycott. That is, despite the fact that people don't really seem to care when a company agrees with their political positions, they certainly do when the company does not and engage in boycotting. But that boycotting, if not the attitudes towards the brand itself, occasionally leads others to intentionally buy the products to support the company or its cause. When MyPillow CEO Mike Lindell was outspoken about his support for Donald Trump, a lot of people, at least online, said that they bought a MyPillow to support Lindell's political actions. Similarly, while many on the left mounted a boycott of Goya products using hashtags such as GoyAway, perhaps not the most well thought out hashtag because, it kinda sounds like it means something else when you say it aloud. After CEO Bob Unanue publicly expressed his approval of Donald Trump, many on the right encouraged buying Goya products, spurred on by Ivanka Trump posting an image of her holding a can of beans, Ted Cruz tweeting with the hashtag #BuyGoya, and Trump himself posing with a selection of Goya products. Thus, there aren't just boycotts spurred by political affiliation and messaging, but also buycotts, when people intentionally purchase products because the company has released some kind of political statement. But who exactly is the kind of person who engages in boycotts or buycotts, and what are the rationales for doing so? For answers, we can look to a doctoral dissertation from Hong, 2018, who conducted a survey of people who had actively engaged in boycotting or buycotting. He found that boycotting was more than 3 times more commonly reported than buycotting, which, hey, makes sense since disagreement with a brand affects attitudes, while agreement generally does not. The emotions felt by these groups differed, in that the most common emotion felt by buycotters was anger, while the most common emotion felt by boycotters was disgust. Other feelings associated with the action also differed between groups, with buycotters feeling more elevated emotionally, feeling more authentic pride but not hubris, and feeling more gracious than boycotters. Additionally, buycotters reported being generally happier and more hopeful people. So it's kind of the Chad boycotter versus the virgin boycotter. To further understand the predictive variables that lead one to be more prone towards boycotting or buycotting, Hong conducted a hierarchical regression and found that low self-efficacy and low levels of gratitude predicted boycotting. Boycotting was further predicted by low levels of referent criterion, that is, having a strong belief in knowing the solution to a social issue, while buycotters tended to be higher in gratitude. As you might expect, positive attitudes towards the brand was related to buycotting, but not boycotting. Moreover, buycotting was related to intentions to change behavior, while boycotting was not, indicating that people may be less likely to follow through with their intentions to support a boycott than those who support a buycott. the number of people involved also played a role, in that when participants believed public support was on their side, gratitude and intentions to enact these behaviors were more influential on action than when the participant perceived a low percentage of support. Thus, when we think that a particular social movement is popular, we're more likely to both boycott and boycott. It makes sense then that the success of a boycott or boycott is therefore reliant on perceptions of the action as normative. Thus, a second study in Hong's dissertation sought to ground some of these more abstract data in a real company and look specifically at the effects of social pressures to conform, this time exposing subjects to a statement from the oft-political overpriced ice cream maker Ben & Jerry's regarding the company's position on gun control. Before reading the statement, some participants were shown the percentage of the public that supposedly agreed with Ben & Jerry's stance, with one group seeing that the stance was very popular, and the other seeing that the stance was unpopular. Subjects were more positive towards Ben & Jerry's when they agreed with the brand stance, when no information about the popularity of the message was given, just as when they believed that others generally disagreed with Ben & Jerry's message. Interestingly, participants were still more positive towards the ice cream company when they agreed with their stance and when they believed the stance was in the minority. In terms of effect sizes, the difference in attitude between Ben & Jerry's in the majority condition was highest, followed by the minority condition and then by the control, indicating that people are more positive towards a brand that shares their political opinions when they believe those opinions are more popular. This tendency was predicted by fear of isolation expressed by subjects, indicating perhaps that they don't want to be left out of a trend. Subjects reported being more likely to boycott Ben & Jerry's when they agreed with their stance on gun control, but were not more likely to boycott the company when they disagreed with their position. Further, those who believed the position was popular were more likely to fear social isolation than those who believed the opinion was unpopular. This all just means that while people might approve of Ben & Jerry's when they agree with their political opinions, particularly when they believe those opinions are popular, they're generally unlikely to boycott rather than boycott. In other words, woke-washing political corporate activism only increases negative perceptions of a company, but haters are unlikely to do anything about their negative attitudes, while supporters might actually engage in boycotts. As with Hong's previous experiments, he sought to understand the predictive variables that might help explain boycott and boycott behavior. Prior experience with boycotting was a predictor of current intentions to boycott Ben & Jerry's, indicating that boycotters tend to be chronic rather than isolated. Boycotting was also negatively related to brand familiarity, meaning people are more likely to boycott brands that they don't know much about or use anyway, which kind of defeats the point of a boycott, doesn't it? The emotions that predicted boycotting were anger and a low sense of gratitude, aka the Critical Role fanbase whenever they play an actual role-playing game. Boycotting, as with boycotting, was positively related to prior boycotting behavior, again illustrating that people who tend to engage in one boycott will likely engage in another. Response efficacy, that is believing the boycott would have a demonstrable effect, predicted boycotting, but not boycotting, as did elevated emotional feelings and an increased sense of gratitude. That is, boycotters anticipate their actions will have a positive effect, and boycotters do not. Moreover, when people think the brand's stance is popular, and they feel a sense of gratitude towards the brand for taking said stance, they are also more likely to be positive towards the brand. Instead, when the position was seen as unpopular, disgust was a more influential emotion than was gratitude. Despite all of this though, not one single emotion was found to be distinctly influential in predicting intentions to either boycott or boycott, except for existing brand attitudes, indicating that while people might be irritated or pleased with a company, popularity seems to be less of an influential factor than general feelings of positivity or negativity towards the brand that existed before any political statement. It seems then that a lot of what goes on as it relates to boycotting, and also boycotting to a somewhat lesser degree, rarely manifests as intentions to change behavior in any meaningful way. So how does the fairly consistent decrease in attitudes towards brands actually manifest, if it does at all, when brands have pissed us off with their advertising? Well, of course, it's in comments on the internet, as seen in a master's thesis from Lima and Oxnevad 2020, in an analysis of YouTube comments in response to two politicized adverts. One from Audi and the other from Always, a brand of menstrual products. The Audi ad focused on the gender pay gap, while the Always ad focused on shedding the phrase "like a girl" of any negative connotation. While the Audi ad, which aired at the Super Bowl in 2017, received a plethora of criticism and negative responses on YouTube before Audi made the ad private, the Always ad, which aired just 2 years prior at the Super Bowl in 2015, was more well received and grew the company's YouTube account by 4,339% in just 3 months. Content analysis of YouTube comments found that most positive comments on the Always ad expressed support towards the cause of stripping the phrase "like a girl" of negative connotations, 40%, while the second most common positive trend was thankfulness towards the brand, 3%. In contrast, most negative comments disagreed with the message, 32%, and the second most negative comments questioned why there was no similar ad denouncing male stereotypes, 5%. Which even I have to say, I would not expect from a company that exclusively makes feminine hygiene products. In turn, comments on the Audi ad were 77% negative, and while the same trends in positive comments, primarily being in agreement with the message, 16%, and thankfulness towards Audi as a brand, 9.6%, were present, in the scant 21% of positive comments, as in the Always ad, the most common theme in the negative comments was disagreement with not just the message, but the facts presented, 36%, and a call to boycott Audi, 25%. In terms of how people said they intended to react to the ad, no commenters said that they intended to boycott Always. Really, at worst, 2.7% said that they felt the Always ad was insincere. However, 15.5% of all comments expressed an intention to boycott Audi. Again, it's unlikely that any of these commenters actually ended up intentionally avoiding Audi cars, but it's also unlikely that anyone went out of their way and bought an Audi because of a woke Super Bowl ad. At least the data don't support that supposition. Instead, it probably just soured the brand in the minds of some, and that might affect future buying behavior long down the line due to a decreased brand attitude. And hey, it seems to have had an effect, as in the year following the Audi Super Bowl ad, wherein the company reported a 7.8% increase in sales in 2017, in 2018, Audi sales fell worldwide by 14%, recovered by less than 2% in 2019, and then dropped another 8.3% in 2020. Now, let's be real, I'm not saying that these sales figures are a direct result of Audi running a cringy Super Bowl ad a few years ago, but a cringy ad can reduce brand attitudes and therefore could play a role in future sales. So while the evidence as to the efficacy of boycotts and boycotts is a bit unclear, we should try to understand the psychological impetus behind anti- and pro-brand activism, which we can see in research from Ackermann and Gundelach 2020 in a study of Swiss participants.
Before you can enter a Swiss heart, you have to climb the wall of shyness, tear down the electric fence of pride, and cross the river of skepticism.
Subjects' personality traits were measured using the Big Five and related to self-reported boycotting activity as a product of political consumerism. Political consumerism is citizen-created action involving people taking charge of matters that they themselves deem to be important. The researchers found that boycotting was a far more commonly reported manifestation of political consumerism than was boycotting. But is one political group more prone towards boycotting or towards boycotting? Generally speaking, people who engage in boycotts and boycotts were fairly similar in terms of their Big Five personality traits, but boycotters were slightly lower in openness to experience and neuroticism, and higher in conscientiousness and extroversion, trends which reflect the findings of Gerber et al. 2011, in that self-described Republicans tend to be lower in openness to experience, higher in conscientiousness, and in extroversion. A study from Burton Plax and Peterson, yep, that one.
There's this idea that hell is a bottomless pit, and that's because no matter how bad it is, some stupid son of a bitch like you could figure out a way to make it a lot worse.
Replicated these results and further found that conservatism was negatively related to neuroticism. That is, people who tend to engage in boycotts are probably a little bit more likely to be conservative than they tend to be left-leaning. The only major difference between boycotters and boycotters in Ackermann and Gundelach's study was in agreeableness, in that boycotters are far more likely to be agreeable than are boycotters. But both Gerber et al. And Burton et al. Found only weak links between political orientation and agreeableness, indicating there isn't necessarily only one political orientation that's more prone either towards boycotting or towards boycotting. But ultimately, the question really is this: do boycotts or boycotts actually have any long-term effects on companies that engage in political activism? A review of empirical data from Nuderreiter and Bhattacharya, 2021, examined how activism ultimately influences sales to give us, at least for now, some pretty definitive evidence of how all of this manifests in practice. They found that boycotts and boycotts are ultimately a pretty mixed bag in terms of immediate implications for company sales, but that this perhaps is dependent on the general consumer base of the product. For example, the 2012 boycott of Chick-fil-A, conducted primarily from left-leaning people who opposed the company's overtly Christian attitudes, only increased sales, while the same was true of the 2012 boycott of Starbucks, coming primarily from conservatives who disagreed with the company's political ideas. Again, only increasing Starbucks sales. The only time when they found that a boycott actually resulted in decreased sales is when boycotts were conducted by the primary market demographic of a given company. When conservatives boycotted Dick's Sporting Goods in 2018, after the company banned the sale of semi-automatic weapons, Dick's reported decreased sales, and when left-leaning people boycotted Target in 2010, that too resulted in a loss of sales for Target. And while it may have stopped left-leaning people from buying stuff at Target, it certainly didn't stop them from going there for other reasons. Thus, boycotts from people who don't usually support a company or product are unsurprisingly ineffectual longitudinally, while boycotts from typical consumers of a product do lead to decreased sales, at least temporarily. So is there truth in the adage, get woke, go broke? Well, seemingly only if the company going woke is alienating its core consumer base. Nike customers aren't going to boycott Nike for woke advertising because Nike customers are already woke, as you can tell from their unilateral support of child labor. So with everything we've learned about how buycotts and boycotts generally only affect people who are already consumers of a product, about who tends to engage in boycotting and boycotting behavior, and the long-term effects of these behaviors, let's come to a few conclusions. Today, we saw that companies have long been wont to associate the corporation with the cause, and that for luxury items in particular, most of us are kind of okay with spending a little bit extra to give a portion of our purchase to a charity. But charities are not what are being promoted by wokewashing, which instead is more advertising and less activism. People will tend to keep buying products that they like regardless of any corporate social responsibility practices that the company tends to engage in, despite the fact that polls seem to indicate most people think corporations should be more involved in social issues. But there appears to be a pretty big difference between donating to a charity and wokewashing, wherein the company usually gives nothing whatsoever to the cause that they are signaling towards, and often even charge more for a product that has been given a coat of woke paint. Unlike corporate social responsibility marketing, wokewashing only seems to have negative effects, alienating consumers who disagree with the messages of the company or product while usually doing very little to increase positive attitudes towards the brand. This is likely because both buycotts and boycotts generally only affect existing consumer behavior, in that when Nike or Ben & Jerry's makes a woke statement, people who disagree already probably don't purchase those products, so the effects of a boycott would be minimal if extant at all. Instead, companies seem to be pretty well aware, in most instances, of who their core consumer base is. I mean, they spend huge amounts of money to figure that out, and thus choose strategically to engage in woke advertising that would likely be accepted by said consumers, which is why boycotts from people who don't purchase these products often produce oppositional boycotts that only increase sales temporarily. Despite this slight uptick in sales, what's not so short-lived perhaps is the effects of wokewashing on attitudes towards the brand. Sure, Starbucks and Nike both saw an increase in sales short-term by appealing to the politics of their consumer base, but regular people might be less likely to patronize those companies in the future because their attitudes have been soured against them long before any supposed boycott ends. Really, the important takeaway here should be that companies don't really care if they're alienating people and not getting any long-term gains financially, because that seems to consistently be what we see in the data. Outside of boycotts, woke advertising does not increase positivity towards a company. It only creates animosity. And unlike Michael Jordan's statement in the 90s, perhaps Nike doesn't need to care that Republicans buy sneakers too anymore. People seem to want more woke-washing, even though they don't tend to reward woke companies with greater sales, and thus we can't attribute the rise of woke advertising as exclusively caused by greed alone, but instead a desire to impose corporate politics on the public as its own end. But hey, what do you guys think? Do you think companies that go woke really go broke, or do they generally fare okay financially? Have you ever stopped purchasing a product from a company due to some advertising that you disagreed with or some message that you found distasteful? Have you ever engaged in a buycott or a boycott due to the political stances of a corporation? Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. And if you liked this video, consider smashing that like button. If you want to support the channel, check out my sponsor, Ground News. It's truly an awesome service and a super useful app that I think really helps cut through some of the obfuscation of media bias. Or you can help me out personally by supporting me on Patreon or Subscribestar, or by buying some merch from my merch store. As always, I want to give an enormous shout out and thank you to all of my supporters on Patreon and Subscribestar. You guys never cease to amaze me with your continued support, and it means so much to me. You really allow me to keep doing nerdy deep dives into data like this. Thank you so much, and as always, dear friends, Altana Volt.